What if I told you that almost every country on Earth is trapped inside an agreement most citizens have never signed, never voted on, and rarely even hear about? An agreement so powerful that even the richest nations can never fully escape debt. An agreement that quietly guarantees something strange. Countries don't just borrow money, they owe each other forever. Right now, global debt has reached levels so large that paying it back completely would require more money than actually exists in the world economy. That sounds impossible. Debt is supposed to end when you repay it. So why hasn't it? Why do nations that repay loans still remain indebted decades later? Why do financial crises repeat every generation? And why do economic rescues often leave countries owing even more than before? Tonight's story isn't about one crisis or one government mistake. It's about an invisible system, built slowly, intentionally, and almost accidentally, that turned debt from a temporary tool into a permanent feature of the global order. And to understand how we got here, we have to go back to a moment when the world economy was completely broken. In the early 20th century, global finance looked very different. Money was anchored to something tangible: gold. Under the gold standard, currencies were tied to fixed quantities of precious metal. Governments couldn't simply create unlimited money because each unit theoretically represented real reserves. At first, this created stability. Exchange rates stayed predictable. But there was a hidden flaw. Gold limited flexibility. When economies slowed, governments couldn't easily stimulate growth. When banks failed, there wasn't enough liquidity to stop panic. And when the Great Depression arrived in the 1930s, the entire system cracked under pressure. Countries began abandoning gold one by one. Trade collapsed. Unemployment soared. Nations raised tariffs to protect themselves, accidentally strangling global commerce even further. By the time World War II began, the international financial system wasn't just weak, it barely existed, and that created a terrifying question for world leaders. How do you rebuild a global economy without repeating the chaos that caused depression and war? The answer would become the foundation of the Invisible Agreement. In 1944, representatives from dozens of countries gathered at a quiet resort in New Hampshire. Their mission sounded simple: prevent future economic collapse. But the solution they created fundamentally changed how money works between nations. Instead of gold directly controlling everything, they built a layered system. Currencies would be linked to one dominant currency, and that currency would be tied to gold. International institutions would help countries borrow during crises. Trade imbalances would be managed through loans rather than sudden collapse. This sounded reasonable, even brilliant. If one country struggled, others could lend support. Temporary debt would stabilize economies until growth returned. But hidden inside this design was a subtle shift. Debt stopped being an emergency measure and became the mechanism that held the system together. Here's why. International trade naturally creates winners and losers. Some countries export more than they import. Others do the opposite. Before, imbalances forced painful adjustments quickly. Now, loans allowed imbalances to continue. Instead of correcting problems immediately, countries borrowed to maintain stability. Short-term relief replaced long-term equilibrium. And at first, it worked beautifully. Post-war economies boomed. Infrastructure expanded. Living standards rose rapidly across much of the world. It felt like economic engineering had finally solved instability. But underneath the prosperity, a dependency was quietly forming. By the 1950s and 60s, global trade exploded. Countries specialized. Supply chains stretched across continents. Capital flowed internationally at unprecedented speed. And debt became the lubricant of growth. Governments borrowed to build roads, factories, and energy systems. Banks lent across borders. Development projects promised modernization. The logic seemed undeniable. Borrowing today would create growth tomorrow. But growth created another problem. As economies expanded, they required more money circulating through the system. More trade meant more liquidity. More liquidity meant more credit. So lending accelerated. Then came a turning point few people noticed at the time. The amount of money circulating globally began to exceed the reserves originally meant to anchor it. The system relied increasingly on confidence rather than physical backing, and once confidence becomes the foundation, stability depends on belief. In the early 1970s, pressure finally broke the old monetary structure. The last direct ties between major currencies and gold disappeared. From that moment forward, money between nations was no longer constrained by physical limits. Credit could expand almost indefinitely, and debt stopped being something that had to end. It became something that had to continue. Because if borrowing slowed too much, growth slowed. If growth slowed, debts became harder to service. And if debts became harder to service, the entire system risked collapse. So the solution was always the same: more lending. The first major warning came in the late 20th century. Developing countries borrowed heavily during periods of cheap credit. Infrastructure projects multiplied. Governments expected export revenues to rise indefinitely. But global interest rates increased suddenly. Loan payments surged. Currencies weakened. And countries discovered something shocking. They weren't just struggling to repay loans. They were borrowing new money simply to pay old interest. Debt had become self-perpetuating. Financial rescue programs arrived, promising stabilization. But rescue loans came with conditions: spending cuts, privatization, economic restructuring. In theory, these reforms would restore growth. In practice, many nations entered cycles where debt restructuring reduced immediate pressure, but increased long-term obligations. Each crisis produced new loans. Each solution created new liabilities. And something else happened that few people noticed. Creditors and debtors became the same group. One nation's savings funded another nation's borrowing. Export surpluses in one region depended on consumption fueled by debt elsewhere. The system no longer had clear winners and losers. It had mutual dependency. Everyone owed and everyone was owed. That's the invisible agreement. Today, global debt exceeds global economic output. Think about that carefully. If every country tried to repay all obligations simultaneously, the world economy would shrink dramatically. Because debt repayment removes money from circulation faster than new money enters. The system survives because debts are rolled forward, refinanced, or replaced. Governments issue new bonds to pay old ones. Central banks inject liquidity during crises. Financial institutions restructure obligations rather than eliminate them. Debt doesn't disappear, it transforms, and this creates strange outcomes. Countries considered economically strong often carry enormous debt loads, not despite their strength, but because of it. Safe economies attract lenders, allowing borrowing to continue indefinitely. Meanwhile, weaker economies face higher interest costs, making escape harder. The result is a global structure, where debt acts less like a burden and more like connective tissue linking economies together. But this interconnectedness also spreads risk. When one major economy falters, shockwaves travel instantly through financial markets worldwide, and every crisis reveals the same pattern. Over the decades, policymakers have repeatedly tried to solve the debt dilemma. Some proposed strict austerity, cutting spending to repay obligations faster. But deep spending cuts often slow economic growth, reducing tax revenue and making debts harder to manage. Others promoted aggressive stimulus, injecting money to boost growth. This helped short-term recovery, but often increased borrowing further. Debt forgiveness programs offered relief to some nations, yet lenders became cautious afterward, raising borrowing costs elsewhere. Even monetary innovations, like extremely low interest rates, produced unintended consequences. Cheap borrowing encouraged even more debt accumulation. Each solution addressed symptoms, not structure, because the system itself relies on continuous borrowing. Stopping debt expansion abruptly would mean shrinking trade, collapsing asset prices, and widespread unemployment. So policymakers face a paradox. The medicine keeping the economy alive is also the condition preventing full recovery. Look closely at recent decades, and you'll notice repeating cycles. Financial bubbles expand during periods of easy credit. Asset prices rise. Confidence grows. Borrowing accelerates. Then something breaks. Housing markets, banking systems, supply chains, or inflation stability. Crisis hits. Governments intervene with massive financial support. Debt rises further. Recovery begins and the cycle resets. What's shocking isn't that crises happen. It's how predictable their structure has become. Data shows global debt rising faster than economic output over long periods. Each generation inherits a larger financial system, requiring more borrowing to maintain stability than the previous one. And here's the twist most people miss. This isn't necessarily the result of conspiracy or deliberate manipulation. It's an emergent outcome of how modern economies coordinate growth, trade, and stability. The invisible agreement exists because every participant benefits, at least temporarily. Borrowers sustain growth. Lenders earn returns. Consumers access goods. Governments avoid immediate economic pain. The costs accumulate slowly, spread across decades. So what exactly is the invisible agreement? It isn't a single treaty. It's a shared understanding embedded in global finance. Debts will rarely be fully repaid. They will be continuously refinanced. Countries implicitly agree to maintain confidence in each other's obligations because the alternative would destabilize everyone simultaneously. This transforms debt from a finite contract into an ongoing relationship. Instead of closure, there is rollover. Instead of endings, extensions. Instead of repayment, management. The system works as long as participants believe future growth will support present obligations. Confidence is the true currency, and confidence depends on cooperation, even among geopolitical rivals, because when nations hold each other's debt, economic collapse becomes mutually destructive. Debt becomes diplomacy. Today, new pressures are emerging. Aging populations strain government budgets. Climate transitions require massive investment. Technological disruption reshapes labor markets. Geopolitical tensions challenge globalization itself. Each challenge demands spending, and spending usually means borrowing. The invisible agreement is being tested by a world that needs more investment than ever. While already carrying historic levels of debt, some economists argue inflation may quietly reduce debt burdens over time. Others warn rising interest rates could expose vulnerabilities hidden for decades. No one knows exactly how the next phase unfolds, but history suggests one thing clearly: the system rarely ends suddenly, it adapts. Modern economies rely on borrowing the way earlier societies relied on physical trade routes. Removing it entirely would halt global commerce. They are pressure, release events inside a system designed to expand credit continuously. Each crisis resets conditions but rarely changes the underlying structure. National debts aren't isolated burdens. They are shared commitments linking economies together in ways that make total withdrawal nearly impossible.